rain hammered against the windows of Ridgeway High, turning the world outside into a blurred gray canvas. Inside, the halls were empty, except for Mrs. Prescott, the school's history teacher. She had stayed late to finish grading essays on the Civil War, her desk piled high with blue-inked papers and coffee cups. As she stacked the last essay, she noticed something odd on the corner of her desk. A small, leather-bound book she hadn't seen before. The cover was cracked with age, the black leather so worn it seemed to absorb the light around it. There was no title or markings, only a faint symbol embossed on the spine, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, almost like a sun. Curiosity piqued, Mrs. Prescott opened the book. Its yellowed pages were covered in names, each written in elegant, looping handwriting. She recognized some of the surnames, students and teachers who had passed through Ridgeway High over the years. But the farther she flipped, the stranger the entries became. Some names were crossed out with thick black ink, while others had symbols next to them that she didn't recognize. At the very back, she found a blank page, except for one name scrawled in fresh ink, Margaret Prescott. Her breath caught. She slammed the book shut and shoved it into her bag. The storm outside intensified as she locked her classroom and hurried home, the feeling of unseen, demonic, and horrific eyes following her every step. The next morning, Mrs. Prescott couldn't shake the unease. She decided to return the book to the school library, thinking it might be some misplaced archive. But the librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, frowned at the sight of it. "This isn't ours," she said, running her fingers over the cracked leather. "I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Prescott explained where she'd found it, but Mrs. Hargrove only shook her head. "That book, it doesn't belong here. Be careful, Margaret, please." Her words lingered in Mrs. Prescott's mind as she returned to her classroom. She set the book on a shelf and tried to forget about it. But as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. The first was the clock. It froze at 3:03. No matter how many times she reset it, the hands refused to move. Then came the whispers, faint at first like a draft through the vents, but growing louder as the hours passed. They weren't words so much as an urgent murmur, pulling at the edges of her sanity. By evening, the book was back on her desk, though she hadn't touched it since leaving it on the shelf. She opened it again, desperate for answers, and found the pages covered in frantic scrawled writing. Her name appeared over and over, followed by the same phrase, "Read them aloud." Against her better judgment, she did. The moment she spoke the first name, the air in the room grew heavy. The temperature plummeted, her breath visible in the dim light. Shadows pooled in the corners of the classroom, deepening until they seemed alive. She read the second name, then the third. With each one, the room seemed to warp, the walls closing in, the fluorescent lights flickering erratically. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling and full of terror. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man in a charred suit, his face featureless, except for empty and deep black eyes. He tilted his head as if listening, then began to walk toward her. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, growing louder with each step. Panicking, she tried to close the book, but her hands wouldn't move. They were frozen, as if the book itself was holding her in place. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from inside her own head. The figure stopped inches away. In a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "Finish the list." "No," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I won't," she said, crying. The figure tilted its head further, its empty dark eyes narrowing. Then it reached out, its fingers impossibly long, and touched the book. The next morning, Mrs. Prescott's classroom was empty. Her bag, her coat, and her lesson plans were still on her desk, but she was gone. The black book lay open, her name crossed out in thick black ink. When the janitor found the book and handed it to the principal, it was dismissed as a strange prank. The principal locked it in his office, but by the end of the day it was back in the classroom, waiting on a new desk. By the next week, students began reporting a strange phenomenon. Every time they walked by Mrs. Prescott's classroom, they felt a cold breeze and heard faint whispers. Some claimed they saw her shadow moving behind the desk, though the room had been locked since her disappearance. And in the library, Mrs. Hargrove swore she found a new name written in the book: Daniel Caldwell.